very warm welcome to everyone. I am Shrija Agrawal, and you are watching our series Demystifying Regulation and Technology. Today's episode really talks about is a deep dive into data protection. But before I deep dive with this August panel, let's do some context setting on the same. The scramble for power over who controls cyberspace has been unanimously awarded to big tech, making them highly profitable ad enterprises that have gained a massive foothold despite little to no privacy regulations and fragile liability laws. You could take all the crony capitalism in the world, and it still wouldn't have any of the dominions that big tech has when it comes to consumers and the economy. This perverse power means that people, economies, and nations are struggling to figure out how to combat these behemoths. It seems like there's no accountability. It seems to have rendered a bigger gap in inequality and lack of opportunity, and it's not a problem familiar only to India. In the US, congressional hearings with figures like Sundar Pichai and Mark Zuckerberg left us even more confused. Misinformation continued to spread at a faster pace after the pandemic. Conservatives claim to have been constantly censored. For instance, former US President Donald Trump had his account suspended on Twitter, which was announced by many, including Chancellor of Germany Angela Merkel, and rapper Nicki Minaj, claims to have been put in Twitter jail after a tweet on vaccines. What's going to happen in India during this information age? We have the Privacy and Data Protection Bill that is being examined, with multiple extensions being granted for the report to be submitted. But the question is, can it really keep pace with this dynamic economic and social reality we are living in? Or will the regulation of big tech in India just be ad hoc? Sure, it's great that in this new wave of digitization, the government is also adopting technology and data driven governance is becoming more and more prominent, especially since COVID 19. But while the adoption of technological capabilities can be lauded, doesn't this also mean there's unfettered access to layers and layers of personal data of Indian citizens that is largely unchecked? Should there be so much concentration of power that could promote or suppress as per their wishes? Should big tech really be allowed to cherry pick what is and isn't fair, thus making them the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes free speech? What's the transparency we see here? To break it all down, understand the data protection rules in India and cross-border, please help me welcome Supratim Chakrabarti and Abhinav Chandan, partners at Ketan and Company. It's my sheer pleasure and privilege to welcome both of you. Let me begin with you, Supratim, and I think it's just sort of taking it further from my opening remarks. We have seen significant progress in the privacy landscape of the last couple of years. More and more jurisdictions are enacting data protection legislations. In light of the global trends on data privacy, what really are your thoughts with respect to data protection developments in India?
Right. Thank you so much, Rija. I think fantastic opening question, I must say, after your, introduction. Um, so many a times, some of our industry folks will come and say, does India at all have a data privacy or protection law? And the answer is yes. It today also has a patchwork of laws which are attending to the requirement of data privacy and protection. Be it the Information Technology Act, the sensitive personal data related rules that are there. Then you have sectoral regulators. For example, the Reserve Bank of India giving its diktat to banks and NBFCs. We are all aware of this data localization related diktat, which was given to payment systems providers, and what happened to MasterCard, etc. We also have our generic laws like the Contract Act, Consumer Protection Act. They're all playing a patchwork of role. We are all looking forward to the mother legislation, which is the upcoming Personal Data Protection Bill. The work has been going on in this since July, August 2017. And we have been very fortunate to be working very closely with the Justice Sri Krishna Committee, with giving inputs to MeitY, to see that we have a robust and comprehensive law. We are hoping that this should be coming out soon. Of course, there's a lot of murmur that now personal data protection bill could suddenly become only data protection bill and also cover non-personal data, etc. We'll have to wait and watch how it pans out. Interestingly, the other regulators, such as say CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team of India, they became very active, especially from the time of lockdown and COVID times. And they have been coming out with interesting advisories. One of the advisory in January 2021 stated that in case there has been a data breach or data leak, immediately inform the CERT-in, which is the nodal body anyways, to capture this information. But they have also stated that immediately inform all data subjects, okay, all individuals who would have been affected by such data breach. Interestingly, this is not coming out of the Information Technology Act or the rules. Neither is it contemplated in this manner in the upcoming Personal Data Protection Bill. It is stated there that, if there is a data breach, then the organization needs to go to the Data Protection Authority, give all information, and if harm is supposed to be caused, then basically you take a call and with the authorities' blessings, and then go out and tell to the world. You can also be asked to put up the details on your website, and if it is catastrophic enough, the authority may put up the details on their website. So you see, we were really debating a very gauged and I would say staggered approach, so that there is a both business and personal privacy both are basically taken into account whilst this data breach reporting takes place. However, what is happening in today's scenario is that we are having advisories which are trying to attend to the situation which is perhaps going beyond the stated law which has been passed by the parliament. Interesting times for India. I'll pause there with my answer, and over to you.
I want to understand and sort of bring in Abhinav also here. Abhinav, you have any sort of comments on the opening remarks on how the data protection development in India is faring? What really are your thoughts with respect to what Supratim said?
Yeah, so it is always interesting to see, positive legal developments to protect citizens' rights. The thing is that, this personal data protection bill has been in the offing for quite a long time. There have been discussions, there have been rumors that it is going to be discussed in this parliamentary session or the next parliamentary session, and it is going to come out soon. Then like Supratim mentioned, that there have been murmurs of integrating non-personal data protection also in this regime for personal data protection. And there are also recent rumors that even the present form of the bill is going to undergo several amendments to make changes to other provisions also. So it's all in flux right now. It's very difficult to comment on what is actually going to be the final shape of the bill. But I would say that it's good that personal data bill at least shows to us that the government envisages a greater level of protection that is existing currently in the country. And I think Supratim can also expand on this, that the current regime is quite meager and newer compared to what should be there, especially compared to other parts of the country, of the world. Sorry.
Okay, taking this further from what Abhinav sort of just mentioned, Supratim, that why do we see this constant flux that we are always going to the drawing board when it comes to the data protection bill? You mentioned that it's been in the works since 2017. And Abhinav also outlined that perhaps what we have right now is mere and meager compared to what is the playbook in other economies. So how should one really think about this bill?
Right. I think, see, we started off very well. And the initial consultation that happened with Justice Sri Krishna Committee, we were part of it. In fact, I traveled quite a bit across the country to attend most of these. And I thought it was a healthy discussion where, tech folks, civil society members, lawyers, everyone, came and gave their inputs. Uh, but when it went back to the government and it was finally presented, some of the tweaks which were made were not very welcome. And of course, you were all aware of this mega issue of data localization, which is basically the data of the country should be housed within the country. Now, there are several theories and counter theories to it. There is a trade theory, which is my data, my oil, I should use it the way I want to. There is a security theory that our law enforcement authorities, agencies, whenever they are asking for information from these intermediaries, we are often told, please come through mutual legal assistance treaty. And therefore, this takes 8 to 11 months at times when the whole purpose of asking for that information fails. Therefore, there is a strife, definitely. And therefore, there's this back and forth. But to my mind, I think we will have to put an end to it somewhere, okay, in order to have a meaningful law rolled out. For example, the latest one that you're hearing of adding non-personal data related elements into personal data protection bill, this retrofitting could be slightly dangerous, because I've seen the entire journey of this bill. Right from the beginning, it was never meant for non-personal data. Now if you try to simply bring in certain elements of non-personal data and think that will be good, it may not be so. It can have some detrimental effect. You have to understand that organizations also spend a lot of time, effort, and money towards non-personal data. Okay, it cannot have the same benchmark parameter, etc. Globally also there are hardly any precedents on this front. Okay, so I think we should be a little careful and try to a conclusion somewhere and get rolling with the law. As far as the template is concerned, I think what we have done really is we have picked up a GDPR type template, and we have not aped it. We have molded it to the Indian situation and requirement, which was really thought through very well during the committee consultation. I think we should go ahead with that, rather than again thinking in every direction right now.
So my question to you, and before we get into the finer details, that you mentioned that people tend to compare data to oil, and we have heard this maxim so much that data is the new oil. What are the kind of signals that this sends out to institutional investors or private capital putting money to India when there's so much of flux on its data protection bill, when there's no consensus being drawn? Ultimately, this can have impact on a lot of industries and sectors, fintech, for instance, e-commerce, for instance. So what really are we seeing, and what is the kind of signal it is sending to other institutional investors, the data localization aspect in particular?
A fantastic question. I think this is irking the entire business ecosystem right now. People are sitting on the fence, and I'll tell you, Shrija, how the whole journey started of data localization. In the previous version of the bill, almost all personal data was supposed to be localized, and then there was a watering down of that stance. And now what we have is personal data can freely go out. Sensitive personal data, there are certain guardrails. It can be transferred, but it should be continued to be stored within the country. And then there is a bucket of critical personal data, which is supposed to be defined, can never leave the country technically. So that is what we have as a thought process right now. Well, what is happening on the ground is no business is trying to take a chance by sifting through data and deciphering that this is personal, this is sensitive personal, therefore personal can go out and sensitive personal should remain in the country. Out of fear, they are trying to store all the data within the country right now. Okay, because no one is aware as to how things will shape up. And with sectoral regulators like, say, Reserve Bank of India coming down so heavily on their ask for data localization for payment systems, it has become all the more critical that businesses sit up and pay heed to this development that is taking place. There are some players, of course, who still want to fight it out, who want to see that a better approach is taken towards this concept. But I think that that number is dwindling right now. So it's important that a quick decision is now taken, and it will only be beneficial for the business ecosystem in India if a quick decision is taken and we move ahead with rolling out of the law.
I want to sort of bring you in up enough to sort of point to what Supratim just mentioned. We understand what entrepreneurs are doing because nobody really knows where the future lies on this one unless the bill comes with proper clarity. Try to sort of explain to me and our viewers here. If I'm a company, fintech company grown out of India, but I have majority of my investors who are say Chinese or are majority owned by foreign investors. What happens to the question of data localization then? Ultimately, I'm majority owned by foreign investor. So does that fear or concern of my data being owned by Chinese authority also creep in? Also rightly so. So how are we trying to solve for this slugfest?
Well, I would start off by saying that some localization may be good. Okay, there are some security perspectives. There are some business perspectives as well. Okay, so and there are precedents in the world as well. Where there have been prescribed uh, restrictions for localizing some form of data. For example, in the U.S. Medical data under HIPAA cannot go out. Okay, and banking data, for example, financial information, which the RBI is now seeking to localized within India. Maybe there is a context to it, so that from a security perspective, from well-being of the users, to protect the users' rights, some localization of some categories of data may be envisaged. That's all good. The arguments that the Indian diaspora had made earlier, and like Supratim mentioned, that that number is dwindling, was also from a competition perspective. See, if you make it mandatory to localize all data or majority of the data, it weeds out the competition from foreigners. Okay, and it bolsters the domestic industry. That was also one of the reasons why one of the bigger digital players in the country was also supporting data localization on the pretext of security. Okay, so that is a business angle to it. Okay, so for data localization, however, this doesn't work according to me. Reasonable data localization requirements are fine, but this is the era of globalization, and digital trade is driving globalization. Okay, so you cannot have data localization requirements which are too restrictive, because that will be the antithesis of globalization, and it will kill digital trade globally. If you India is now trying to become a digital hub. It wants to be an outsourcing hub also. So, if you have data localization requirements, and similarly other countries also start doing that, how do you outsource? How do you develop your outsourcing industry? Nobody will send data to you then. So, I think it's a double-edged sword. It has to be, very skillfully handled.
Okay, so I see this. Perhaps there's one party which is pro data localization. There's one perhaps saying with data localization should not really be there. So, how should one solve for it? It sort of boils down to having a very nuanced relationship on data protection. Is it a playbook to really follow, or are they really clear answers? These are very large questions that we're dealing with here.
I will, I think, try to conclude this by saying, like Abhinav mentioned, that certain degree of localization may be required for several reasons, national security, etc. Uh, but to paint the whole world because of just such requirements for all data, to localize, etc., I think that's not a good idea. We should be very careful of the buckets that we are intending to localize, and there should be a clear rationale behind it. There should also be clear exceptions where there can be a derogation from such localization requirement.
So, Abhinav, you agree with that? That
Absolutely, absolutely.
some bit of data localization is fine, but you can't paint everything with the same brush, is what Supratim's
Absolutely,
point.
100%. 100% agree with Supratim. Like I said, it's a double-edged sword. It has to be used skillfully, and you have to be very careful about what buckets of data you try to localize. Because, like I was saying, if you do too much, you will disintegrate your own digital trade, your own development. India wants to be a trillion-dollar digital economy. How do you do that without outsourcing?
I would like to also talk about this entire question of individual consent that comes to the fore in data narratives always. And if individual consent really as a bulwark, it's really as the key center, the key premise on which the best practices regarding data collection and processing are found in digital economy, how meaningful is consent as a basis for data protection? I'll sort of start with you, Supratim, and perhaps also get Abhinav's viewpoint on this one.
Great question, Shrija. I think let me pick up from one of the interesting conversations that we had with Justice Sri Krishna on this during the committee consultations. So we were discussing what is really consent in a country like India, where there is such large illiterate population, where population, is there which is speaking so many diverse languages. But when an app is downloaded, we do an I accept or an I agree in English and move ahead. Even the most educated ones are, I think, going through a consent fatigue, and we none of us, I think, perhaps read everything and just do an I accept and move ahead with life, right? So it is understandable that there is a requirement to have a separate mechanism to safeguard data. And the way I would look at it, Shrija, is that there are two pillars. Okay, one pillar is that of consent or any other ground of processing data, just like say a government related access or others. The other one is safeguarding the data even after taking the consent. Just because you have taken consent in some legalese and you say 10 things there does not mean that it's free for you to do whatever you want to do with the data. So there are security norms to be followed as a second pillar of storing or saving the data. So that's a concept that I wanted to first put forth. The other important thing here is that the upcoming personal data protection bill has thought through this issue, and therefore we have very interesting elements there. At one place it is stating that where it is required and it's feasible, have this also translated in regional languages. Okay, so whilst we understood clearly when we were debating this particular bill that it would be good to have these terms and conditions, privacy policy may be put in different languages, but you cannot put the shackles in the hands of the business and say you mandatorily do XYZ 15 languages, right? So it's been nice. I think enabling provision has been provided, number one. Number two is that there's something called data trust score. Okay, just like you're scoring. So if there is some higher degree of processing taking place by certain players who are known as significant data fiduciaries, who are processing a lot of personal or sensitive personal data, etc., they can have this data trust score. So when you are approaching a particular application or a website, if you see that score, you are automatically already comforted that this particular player will take care of my data properly. And you need not deep dive into what they're doing behind this, right? So I think these are interesting concepts. That's how we have tried to solve for it. Uh, Consent remains an important pillar, but that is not all.
That is well said. That's very interesting. And I sort of tend to completely agree with you here. In a country like ours, which is so diverse and just given the levels of literacy, data and consent can be a really tricky issue because most of us, invariably, without knowing, have the natural propensity of pressing I accept just to get things done and get off that window. And one doesn't really know what we are getting into. So, my simple question to this pre very specialized and very expert panel here. Who should really own the data? It's my data, my personal details. Should I really trust my government with this data? Should I trust the corporation I'm doing business on a daily business with this data? Who should really own my data? Ultimately, it is as private as it can get.
Shrija, globally, a data subject is branded as a data subject, right? And a data controller, would be deciding on how, and what should be done with your data. That's why they are named that way. Interestingly, in our personal data protection bill, Justice Sri Krishna named the data subject as a data principal and data controller as a data fiduciary, because he wanted to give a relationship of trust between them. And they
Wow.
said that after the Britishers have gone, I would not like to call any of my fellow Indians as subjects. So they are data
Yes.
principals.
So I want to understand from you, Supritam and Abhinav here, that can this data quagmire can really be solved? Because we have come very far in the journey of attracting so much capital, and so much data is already in the hands of this big tech. So how can we solve for this really? This is something which even globally has not been solved.
Shrija, I think you've used the word, I think, unknowingly in your question, which is journey. To my mind, data privacy and protection is a journey, especially for a country like India. When GDPR came into effect in the European Union, they gave 2 years for people to prepare. And we saw that for even European players, 2 years was not sufficient. So, in the Indian context, it would be a quantum leap from almost nothing as a law or very bare bone structure as a law to an European equivalent law. But if we are able to successfully cover this journey, I think at the end of it, we will see light. Okay. Over to you, Abhinav, if you want to add something to this.
Yes.
Not much to add here. You have covered, summed this up very beautifully. Going back to the question on consent, and there are voices, and there are even laws which say that the consent should be clear and it should be informed, and all of that is fine. But like Supratim said, what do you do when nobody wants to look at what the consent is for, and what do you do with the illiterate masses? They can't understand what. So this is very unique to the Indian context. And the question also is that, once you have transferred that data, you think that you own that data, but when entities work on that data and make something out of it, you know does it still remain your data? Though I'm just giving a contrary perspective. You have given your data, it has been put into a database. Is it their intellectual property? Is it, then should they be free to use it as they want? These are all business questions, and I believe, if you have added value to that data, maybe they can share the benefits from it. It's difficult to answer, still who should be the owner of that data. Maybe Supratim
Okay.
can elaborate on this even more.
Sipratim, I want to come back to you. You mentioned in your sort of previous answer that Shrija, the current data protection framework is bare bone. And now India is certainly moving towards a new framework. So my question to you really is that how do you think the law will change the marketplace in India? Abhinav also kept talking about the business implications of things. In other words, what really you think are the key takeaways for businesses and consumers in the new framework? You could perhaps give us some examples mentioning some sectors to explain that better.
Right. I think let me start with the consumers. The first thing that will happen is that they will get more right and authority over their own data. Okay. To knock the doors of these data fiduciaries slash controllers and ask that what data do you have about me? I want to correct my data, erase my data, port it to another player. That is the right that they will have. And on the other side of the fence, it is the data controllers or data fiduciary, like I mentioned, they have to be prepared for these asks, because the European Union experience has shown us that some of these requests will be really from rogue customers or disgruntled employees, right? So that's a good example maybe that we can keep in mind as we go along. We have to be prepared, because it is perhaps not the regulator who will come knocking at your door first. It is the individual who has a new weapon in his hands to come knocking at your door, and you have to be prepared for that. Okay. How do you attend to this particular requirement? What we have seen again from the European Union experience is that dashboards are created. So you as an individual can go to the dashboard of that organization, put in your request. There's a token given to you, a token number. Accordingly, you can follow up with the organization, and then you will get an access to the portal, wherein you can change, you can edit your data, you can ask for an erasure of your data, etc. At the same time, the GDPR experience has also shown us where we should be additionally careful. There has been instances of data theft when such dashboards have been created and put to use. So the learning for us is good that GDPR is 3 years ahead of us, because we have also to learn from their errors or mistakes. So these dashboards, we have to ensure that we put in adequate mechanism for authenticating the individual who's getting the access to data. Otherwise, it can be counterproductive. So just an example, Shrija, like you were asking. Um, what should organizations be prepared for? I think the most important thing is realization of what personal data they are housing, right from the entry of data to the exit point, the entire route that they're following. Okay. And how each of the organs of their organization are dealing with personal data. That's the first thing. The more important legal element here would be the compliances. Okay. Once you've understood this, I think putting in place the compliances would be fairly easier. Okay. And then you have the front looking documents, such as say a privacy policy or a consent or a notice. These are quick fixes to my mind, but only lip service will not do. Some people, they go for a well crafted privacy policy. I have had situations like that where they wanted that, GDPR is coming into effect from tomorrow. Why don't you recraft my privacy policy? I will just upload it tonight. Tomorrow morning onwards, you are GDPR compliant. That does not work. So what you're writing, you have to actually put that into effect. only lip service will not work.
If I were to ask you, what is your opinion on the responsibilities of entities collecting and processing personal data under the new framework in comparison to the GDPR? A quick one on that, Supratim.
Yeah, so very quickly, like I was mentioning, that we have adopted the framework, but we have not aped it completely. Okay, there are differences between the two. So organizations who think that if they are GDPR compliant, automatically they are compliant with the upcoming law of the country, that is incorrect. Okay, let me give you some examples. Age of consent in India even today is 18 years, and it continues under the bill as well. Under GDPR, it is 16 years. It can go below up to 13 years depending on the member state. Financial data is considered to be sensitive personal data even today under Indian laws, under IT Act and the rules. Um, Under the GDPR, it is not considered to be that special category of data. Um, right to be forgotten, very interesting concept. Okay, this was debated very hard again. Uh, the way our right to be forgotten is written is slightly different from how the world understands it. Um, if you read our bill, it states that it is actually a right against further disclosure. And the reason was that when this was getting debated, people wanted to understand what is the real menace that we are trying to curb. Because in the tech world, it is slightly difficult to sign off and say that I have deleted every iota of information that I have about you in my organization. But what is the menace? The menace is that I should not be sharing it further, I should not be processing it further, right? So, if you see the crafting of the language, it is stating that it is a right against further disclosure. I think it was a very balanced approach to have been taken, very different from GDPR concept or many of the laws across the globe. Unfortunately, in the 2019 version of the bill, when it was finally presented to the parliament, there was another element, right of erasure, added, which to my mind should have been avoided because the good work was already done through the right to be forgotten.
Now, we spoke about so much of data protection, the entire idea behind consent, GDPR framework, how India is really trying to get the best practices to the fore. But despite the heightened sensitivity towards data protection and privacy rights, we have seen a spike in the number of significant data breaches, even globally. What are your thoughts on this?
See, I'll tell you. So there are several legs to this. One would be, say, knowledge, which I think should be number one. Okay, you can spend a lot on cybersecurity measures, etc., but if you have not educated till the last person on the floor, all this hard work, time, effort, money put may be fruitless. Okay. The second is, of course, proper standardized measures which should be applied across across the sectors, and some sectors which are more susceptible or more vulnerable. I think there should be higher measures which should be adopted. And finally, uh, enforcement, where I think we lacked quite a bit in our country is in the past we have not come down very heavily on breaches, on measures where parties were clearly in on the wrong side, but only token penalty was sort of meted out by the court. So that has created a culture of we don't care. Okay, which is also sending a very wrong signal to the ecosystem outside the country. I think it's therefore now about time that we have this particular bill quickly in place, which has got, say, GDPR equivalent structure for penalties, competition law type, and also, measures which cybersecurity measures should be built in. Of course, there is a leeway given under the bill. They have not hardwired it or hard coded it, stating that you have to follow this. But there are guardrails which have been put, which should finally ensure that we have better protection measures.
Thanks for that, Supratim. You spent quite a bit of time on individual consent, data protection, GDPR, data breaches, what the government should do, and this entire slugfest of RegTech, which is why we are having this entire series, and how government should approach this in a very nuanced way. I think Abhinav has a point to make. Yes, Abhinav.
Sorry, before we jump to the next half of the session, I just wanted to add something on data breaches. So I believe that just a small point that I believe that it is impossible to do away with data breaches altogether. All this data is stored digitally, and it can be accessed digitally also. And technology beats technology. So whoever wants to access that data with a malified intent, they can do it. And if you see the incidents of data breach, these are not data breaches occurring from small time organizations who have not implemented measures. There have been breaches from Apple and credit card companies and big social media organizations, so who would have implemented the recommended measures. But this is a menace that will stay, and this is a problem of the digital world at a larger scale. Laws cannot really protect from breaches happening.
I think
Okay,
one
yeah.
additional, I'm sorry, I am just jutting in, a very interesting point that you made, Abhinav. And globally, Shrija, what we observe is demonstrating compliance is becoming a very big thing, which is a good thing. To my mind, if you have done whatever was required to be done under law, or you largely endeavored to do it, you should get some bit of insulation. Okay, and that is what we are observing, not only in the data privacy protection space, Rija, but other digital laws. For example, the intermediary related rules that have come out. If you see the stance of the government, I think it is very clear that are you doing what is required or endeavoring to do what is required to be done. Okay, and then take a look at your issue through that lens, and not just because there have been something catastrophic which has happened where you did everything but still it happened.
Now, talking about the cross border stuff in detail with you, and I want to spend about the next 20 minutes with you here, Abhinav. My first opening question to you in this regard really is about globalization. Now, with globalization and cross border data transfers being an essential part of business and consumer services, how does one really strike a balance between growth and privacy?
Yeah, thank you, Shreja. Well, taking from some of the points that we have already discussed, I think we can appreciate that the issue is primarily of the scale and pace of the growth of the cross-border and digital tech industry and services. And when we talk about scale, we not only mean the volume, but also the new categories and types of the data that are being collected or transferred across borders compared to the past, and how much digital services and digital convergence have penetrated across borders. So, given this global scale up, the question is whether at the same time there has been an equal recognition from all stakeholders, the users, the corporations, the legislatures, the judiciaries, the law enforcement, and other government agencies about the actual necessity and benefits of ensuring privacy of personal data. I think that's where the answer lies for creating a balance, because once there is recognition, then other things will have to follow. Because here we also have to keep in mind that this is not a passing or temporary growth phase. With 5G coming in, artificial intelligence, and IoT around the corner, when we will have all our devices, ACs, cars, fridges, all of which will be digitally connected, the cross-border flow of data will also shoot up accordingly. And as entrepreneurs or people in the industry, we would not want to hinder that progress or growth or its pace or scale. So the focus, like I said, should be on recognition first about where we stand now, where we are headed, and what can be done, but without going too far or without falling short. Also, we have to recognize that cross-border transfers, when we talk about cross-border transfer, this is not only speaking about data that is going outside your country, but also data coming into your country. Okay. And also we have to recognize that therefore this is not an issue which can be solved in isolation. uh, we have to protect both inward and outward transfers of cross-border data. And this is not an idealistic or academic discussions like we have just discussed. We were discussing GDPR and other developments across the globe. These are triggering changes and discussions in other parts of the world as well. And we have the PDP bill uh, being envisaged on those lines also. So, let's take a step back for context for our viewers who are being introduced to this topic, global e-commerce has already grown thousands of times over the last 30, 40 years. And, like we were saying that, cross-border data flow has been driving the globalization movement and economy. And if you look at the lockdown and the pandemic period, for example, for reference, cross-border digital networks have quite literally held the sky on their shoulders. So it might be valid thought to say that there is not much that we can or should do about the growth of the industry per se. But now let's look at the other half of the picture as well, where uh, what has also happened is that the types of collection of data has also diversified. It has become more granular. You give away your financial information, your device type, what products you think, or what products you like, or things you search for, among other things. And it would again appear that consumers generally, for them, the level or type of data that is being collected has become immaterial. And we were discussing that consent is just a click through. Nobody cares what data is being collected. They don't even read through what are the, even if the information is given to them, they don't care. So the convenience of the digital offering is has become paramount for them. Okay, and to add to that, we have businesses who were never in the digital space. For example, chemical manufacturers, they are adopting cross-border digital integration as well to optimize costs or quality or logistics. Many organizations outsource their shared services like HR and employee management to countries like India and Philippines. This involves significant cross-border personal data transfers, uh, and not of just any data, but of personal data. So, in the end, if we look at it, we are expecting a lot from technology, and technology expects data in return.
Beautiful insight that you provided here. Different way to look at the entire COVID-19 induced growth that we are seeing. The two terms that were used the most for digital transformation. Every company had to almost digitally transform itself. But one has to understand the ramifications it had on our data and how our data was handled, used by these corporations and also by corporations across the border. And so much of data which also came in. And this race on growth winning over privacy is something which we need to really factor in as business leaders, as business owners. But I'm not really sure how much of this is being accounted for because the technology growth is just so fast and also operating in an environment of super abundant venture capital that I'm not really sure how many are really thinking about concerns of data. And while no, everybody talks about the COVID-19 induced, the pandemic induced growth, how India added so many digital users, but what it did to our data and how we even think about it are deeper questions that need to be asked here. Uh, that is sort of an interesting insight. And taking it further from there to what you also mentioned, Abhinav, that one needs to see this entire issue holistically. You also said that consumers' recognition has actually triggered legislatures and judiciaries across the globe to implement high standards of data protection, including for cross border data processing. So, what really is the global scenario with respect to regulation of cross border data transfer?
So, firstly, yes, there is heightened sensitivity in many consumer landscapes towards data collection methods and the privacy measures that are being followed by entities. You would have, just for example, you would have noticed that many prominent businesses are now quite visibly offering their products with data privacy controls as a main feature or selling point. You have mobile handsets, you have messaging platforms, and what have you. I mean, uh, privacy is a prominent advertisement for them. And when we come to the regulation of it, we now actually have large countries and blocks like the whole of EU and even India to some extent, who are increasingly accepting that digital cross-border trade involves, firstly, it involves both inward and outward transfers, and both need to be protected regardless of nationality. And India, for example, is like we discussed. It is trying to become an outsourcing hub, and If we cannot show that we can protect foreign data in adequate measure, then the ambition of digital India suffers a hit. And like we discussed, there is a new law coming up. But meanwhile, last year, while we are still figuring out what law should be implemented, the framework, last year, a very real test arose for this very situation, a problem of cross-border transfer from another part of the world. And I'm referring to the EU, where we already have the GDPR and the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, which we know clearly impose one of the stricter privacy regimes globally. And one of the key mainstays of that regime is that you have to ensure adequate level of protection to EU data within and outside EU. So EU countries are required to have enough mechanisms and laws to achieve that. Then there is another procedure called an adequacy decision to include list of countries outside of the EU, which the EU Commission in its assessment thinks is able to ensure the EU standards. And we have countries like Canada and USA, sorry, not USA, Canada, Japan, and a few other countries in that list, not India or USA. And so outward transfers to uh, of EU data to those countries within the EU and in the adequacy list becomes simple. But for those countries like ours who are not in that list, EU recommends additional measures like use of standard contractual clauses, also called as SCCs, and something called a binding corporate rules or BCRs, which are both in the form of contractual safeguards applicable on the data recipients outside of the EU.
But let's simplify the
And
legalese here, Abhinav. If you were to sort of
okay,
tell me that as an entrepreneur, what are the key three things that I should be aware of, that I should really know, that can actually make or mar the growth trajectory of my organization, keeping in mind the data rules, especially cross-border? What would those be?
so three principles I would say. One is protect both inward and outward data. You have to protect, and you have to see whether the surveillance laws or any law within your country override any contractual mechanisms that you might have entered with uh, the entities outside from whom you are getting or transferring data to, which override the protections that you have agreed. Okay, if you might have contractually agreed that you will not transfer this data, but maybe a law in your country might say that grant a statutory right to your government to access that data. So then, you know, EU considers it, for example, as inadequate protection. It sees it as data of the EU citizens if it comes to India, and if India has laws like that, uh, the government can access EU data. So there is no sufficient protection to EU data, and therefore the question then comes is, can EU citizens or foreign nationals who are not Indian citizens, do they have actionable rights against that access or against any misuse of their data within your country? Okay, so being foreign nationals, uh, and then you have to analyze then how the laws in your country operate. Are they sufficient, or do they require supplementary or organizational or technical measures to provide an adequate level of protection, which is globally recognized as per the highest standards in the world for data protection? And towards this, there was a judgment in the EU last year, which I was mentioning. Because of this landscape has changed. It's called the Schrems 2 judgment, which based on which basically what EU is saying is, are you good enough? Are your laws good enough? Do you provide adequate level of protection to EU citizens against any unlawful access? And do EU citizens have actionable rights to challenge that? Yeah.
So does that also pose any kind of implication, ramification for businesses between India and the EU, the
Absolutely,
entire construct?
100%. The judgment had caused an uproar, because, like I was saying, there were some approved mechanisms. Okay, either you are in a list, you're fine. or you enter into these SCCs and BCRs and you're fine. That's what was happening. But the judgment, what it did was, it said, see, those SCCs, if you're a non-approved country, uh, they can't override your domestic laws. Okay, contracts generally cannot override statutory rights. And if there is such a right, then the BCR and the SCCs are kind of useless. So, uh, you have to then reassess the entire transfer mechanism that has been happening, and this hit the Indian outsourcing industry badly, because, like I was saying, we are trying to be a digital hub, and we want to provide services to EU businesses as well. So a lot of questions started coming in after this judgment, that if BCRs are not enough, what is to be done? Sorry, if SECs and VCRs both are not enough, what is to be done? So the what is to be done was, uh, the judgment required that both the data exporter and the importer, data importer being an entity in India, if we take India as example, they need to sit down and assess the laws of the country. Take this humongous exercise of assessing all the laws in the country and then decide whether the laws in India can provide adequate protection to the EU citizens whose data is coming into India. So that exercise is still going on. There was some clarity provided through periodic guidelines and all, but and one of the guidelines, new SCCs based on the new guidelines, had to be implemented by the end of this month. But still, it is a developing space, and entities are still watching out.
Okay, thanks for providing insight on the Shrems to implication on India. I think this is a great conclusion to our entire conversation. But before I conclude, Supratim, any thoughts on the cross-border regulation around data and how the space is evolving? Any observation on that?
Right. So, Shrija, I would just like to end with this remark that with great difficulty, we have had great success in internet. Let us not make it splinternet all over again, where we are trying to bucketize data and see that jurisdictions have their data housed within their country and create guardrails, which is ultimately detrimental for all. That is all that I would like to say. Rest, I think you've heard all the details from Abhinav on this.
Okay, that's well said. And I had a very meaningful conversation from both the partners at Ketan and Company, really taking us through the entire nitty-gritties of how to think about data protection. Whilst one think about the COVID-19 induced growth, how one has to really be very careful of what it has done to our data, what consent really means, how organizations and business leaders have to be very, very careful of the data protection bill that is about to come about, and a message to regulators going on here that how we have not necessarily aped the GDPR, but really, really tried to see to it that we provide it with great context of India and the best practices here. Very meaningful conversation, and start to do some rapid fire and a quick fun here. I'll begin with you, Supratim. If you could describe privacy of the future in one word, what would it be?
Knowledge about it, I think.
Okay, your favorite takeaway from this session?
I think we have had a great conversation. All the snippets have been laid out well. But I think the conversation on consent was the most engaging one.
Okay, surveillance capitalism. Can consumers ever benefit from it?
Yes and no, I think, because there are pros and cons. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Abhinav, I think you will give me some better answers on that one. If you could describe privacy of the future in one word, what would that be?
Non-existent.
Okay, and what is your favorite takeaway from this session today?
A lot of insight from both sides. I think, again, I would say consent was one of the topics that will stay with me. Yeah.
Okay, both of you really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And surveillance capitalism, can consumers ever benefit from it?
See, it depends on the landscape. Surveillance in a country with 1.3 billion population, with which can trigger like this. Okay, that's a different implication than we talk about surveillance in Switzerland. Okay, so it's
So
very
both
easy
of you
to.
have not provided straightforward answers to this, but I think I would leave it at that, because data and the question of data and the answers to them are not necessarily a straightforward one. That is what I'm gathering clearly.
Correct.
It's a very nuanced perspective, and my strong urge to business leaders and investors behind those businesses is to be very wary of what data and the rules are going to come by can do to your business. And that is necessarily exactly why we are having this entire series on reg tech conversation. Innovation industry will move very fast. Regulation will play a catch-up game, but it really can make or mar the growth trajectory of your organization. And that, till the time I see you next, goodbye and good luck. And thank you, Supratim and Abhinav, for really joining in. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure
Thank
being
you.
you. Bye.